Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Megan Nolan, and I am the current president of the Adelphi Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, also known as ASPP. We'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending our first of many presentations in our 2022 Meet the Author series. There are two parts to tonight's presentation. First, we will listen to Dr. Danielle Knafo and Dr. Spiros Orfanos discuss Danielle's most recent book, The New Sexual Landscape in Contemporary Psychoanalysis, for about an hour. And then at that point, we'll open it up for all of you to participate. Throughout the workshop, please write any questions or comments in the chat box. And at the end, by the second part of the event, we'll unmute you for you to ask your questions. Today's event is non-HIPAA compliant and will be recorded and be posted on our ASPP YouTube channel, which has been pasted in the chat box below. Before I introduce you to Dustin Kaoud, the chair of our Meet the Author Committee, I'd like to remind you that ASPP's 2022 membership drive has started. If you would like to renew or become a member, please visit our website, which is also posted or pasted in the chat box below. As we move into the new year, some of our events, like our Meet the Author, will stay free to members, but non-members, there will be a fee. Our analytic community continues to get stronger and stronger with each member, so please consider joining. I see that both our Dean, Jack Barber, and our director, Amira Simher Alpern, have joined us, and I'd like to thank both of them for their support. At this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dustin Kaoud, our Meet the Author chair, who will introduce Dr. Knafo and Dr. Orfanos. Thanks, Dustin.
Thank you, Megan. Hi, everyone. Welcome to ASPP's Meet the Author presentation of the New Sexual Landscape and Contemporary Psychoanalysis. I'm very pleased to be introducing Danielle Knafo and Spiros Orfanos as the speakers for this very special Meet the Author event. If you were looking for some sort of scandalous Zoom chat room, I'll have to direct you elsewhere. You would be in the wrong Zoom room. However, if you want to understand the future of sexuality and technology's impact on sex and psychoanalysis, you've come to the right place. Danielle is a prolific author who has written extensively on the topics of sexuality, creativity, gender, psychosis, trauma, and technology. The New Sexual Landscape in Contemporary Psychoanalysis, written with Rocco Labasco, is her 9th book. I'll try to keep this short, but I just want to say how influential these two people have been for me and for the field of psychoanalysis. Danielle Knafo was my professor and mentor in the doctoral program of Long Island University and was the first person who got me into psychoanalysis. I'll never forget how she said it. Get into psychoanalysis. She has inspired so many students to pursue psychoanalytic training over her years at Post and helped so many students to really seek out what drew them to psychoanalysis in the first place, the unconscious mind. She kept the spirit of psychoanalysis alive at Post and will never be forgotten by her students for that. She referred me to the Adelphi postgraduate program, where she was teaching at the time, and the rest is history for me. Danielle also teaches at the NYU postdoctoral program for psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, where she first put me in touch with Spiros. Danielle recommended I apply to the externship at NYU postdoc, where Spiros was the director, and I'll never forget my interview with him. Spiros asked me what my favorite book was, and not knowing any better, I replied, Freud and Beyond by Stephen Mitchell and Margaret Black. I'll never forget how he looked at me in disbelief and asked in his kind but genuinely curious way, "That's really your favorite book?" That's when I knew Danielle had steered me towards the right person. Ever since he has joined Danielle in helping to raise me, I consider the two of them to be my psychoanalytic parents and family. Spiros is currently the director at NYU postdoctoral program, and he's very graciously agreed to join us this evening to discuss Danielle's book, The New Sexual Landscape in Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Spiros has a long history of writing about both the clinical and cultural aspects of psychoanalysis and the humanities, including an interview with Danielle on creativity that was published in Psychoanalytic Perspectives. Spiros also produces music programs and albums, the last one titled Love Matters. And now we have the pleasure of hearing the two of them together. So without further ado, Danielle Knafo and Spiros Orfanos.
Thank you, Dustin. I'm going to just take the initial lead here and basically have a conversation with Danielle about her new book, a fabulous book, and you'll get the drift as I repeat that in different ways throughout the next hour or so, for many reasons. And I think I'll offer some of my reasons, and perhaps you'll make a similar judgment, or perhaps you'll make a different judgment. But I really, I'm honored to be here. I thank the Adelphi Society. And it's always a pleasure for me to be interacting with Adelphi for many reasons, not the least because you have a Greek name. And later during the interview, there'll be another reference to the Greek, which is a quibble that I have with Danielle, but you'll have to wait for that until we get into it a little bit. I really appreciate all of you being here because, you know, I recognize that this weekend has been a snow day, a snow weekend in many respects, and some of you have been, I hope you've all been safe, and I hope you've all been safe from COVID, or as safe as you possibly could be. And given that we're on the threshold of the third year here of the COVID epidemic, I also appreciate that you're willing to experience further Zoom fatigue and be here with us today. And I think it'll be worth it, because I do believe that this is a special book. And I'll just say a few introductory things about the book and then start the conversation with Danielle. And the book is special because it covers a very important landscape, and the sexual landscape and psychoanalysis, as the title implies, and some of the cataclysmic changes that are coming up for us, that are happening in the culture, that have an immediate effect on psychoanalytic practitioners of all types. And I think that, you know, I loved reading the book because it is very scholarly on a number of levels, the theoretical, the clinical, and also the social. But it is a book that made me anxious because, you know, I worry about COVID, I worry about nuclear war and what's going on, and with threats, the geopolitical threats, and I worry about climate change. And now I'm worried about the changing sexual landscape and keeping up with it, which is, I just barely got to understand what the old sexual landscape was for psychoanalysis. So it's made me a little uneasy, but I wouldn't be a psychoanalyst if all I wanted was ease. I wouldn't be doing clinical work if all I wanted was to flow through practice and events and so forth. And in a way, the book is very, very properly challenging to all of us. And I also think in a good way, very balanced. It's reminding us about the centrality of sexuality in Freud's time. It's trying to understand what happened to our interest in sexuality as clinicians, and perhaps even on a larger cultural scale. Not perhaps, it is trying to understand what happened on a larger cultural scale. And I think I would definitely suggest you buy this book. And I was joking with Danielle before we started about even the, sometimes you can't tell a book by its cover, but this book you can tell by its cover. It's a Georgia O'Keeffe painting from 1930, I believe. And I don't know what your associations are to this, but I have very strong associations to this. Danielle, why did you pick this cover? I imagine you did it rather than the publisher.
I did. I design all of my book jackets. I picked it because it's a very beautiful painting by Georgia O'Keeffe. I felt that Georgia O'Keeffe's flower paintings are always so sexually and sensually suggestive. And so I thought that it would, you know, attract that kind of feeling just by looking at it.
Well, given, I don't, yes, I could see that it was very thoughtful because, for so many years you were writing about creativity and artists, and have had, I think, like 3 or 4 books on the creative process, psychoanalysis, and so forth. And these last couple of books have been about sexuality and the changing culture around that. Back about 3 or 4 years ago, you did the Age of Perversion book with Labaska also. So I know you've written about other things too in terms of mental illness and trauma, but I think you're also taking a leap forward, particularly with this book, because you're also integrating a whole bunch of issues, especially around psychoanalytic theorizing. And what I want to just quickly go to just to orient folks, and I'm going to stop very soon. Although sometimes I need external controls, so if I go beyond another
Dustin.
5 minutes, Dustin, if I go beyond 5 minutes, stop me. Okay.
Okay, will do.
By the way, I just want to say, Danielle, we did a good job with Dustin, didn't we? Raising him.
It's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress, but if you think about it, I mean, you were kind of like the mommy, and I was the daddy on some level, so we're very proud of you, Dustin.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
You've done good. I think one of the main messages of the book, and I'll go to this right away because I'd like folks to keep in mind, is I don't know exactly where the conversation is going to go, but and I'm quoting Danielle here, that psychoanalysis must speak with the culture about the culture itself, interrogating it from a meta-psychological perspective. So I think that, to me, that's very important, because Danielle is telling us not only do we need it clinically, do we need to know what's going on in the larger culture, and to go beyond what's going on in the consulting room, in the clinical, in the clinic, as she refers to it. But we also we might want to be available to critique what's going on in the culture itself and to talk about it, but to critique from a position of a non-judgmental position. So I think that that's very important. So I think it goes 2 ways. On page 24, you talk about how it could be unsettling, the book.
Yeah. And
you suggest that we be alert to that in ourselves in reading it, right?
Yes.
So I think that that's very important. That's why I think about it almost in ethical terms. And the second caution that you make is that you also say, I guess, as you're thinking about what are the universals that are going on, you're also reminding us that it's so important to keep in mind the uniqueness of the individual. Yeah. So as we talk about the gender bending, as we talk about the new sexuality, as we talk about techno-sex, as we talk about pornography, it's crucial to be mindful of the individual and the uniqueness of the individual's experience, which I think is a fundamental principle of the psychoanalytic approach. Not to be careful about how we generalize about groups, even though we fall into that trap very easily. The book is divided into 4 chapters. The first 2 chapters are about the changes, the various changes that are going on in terms of the losing the gender binaries. And there's some wonderful people, certainly people that I'm familiar with, that Danielle refers to, certainly from the contemporary feminist relational camp, people like Virginia Golder, Jessica Benjamin, Muriel Dinham, and who are Ken Colbert, who are really challenging and have very successfully, I think, if I've understood it correctly from your perspective, Danielle, have very successfully challenged gender binaries, and binaries of all sorts having to do with sexuality. And that's the first chapter. The second chapter talks a great deal about the new sexuality, and particularly the changes in heterosexuality, the changes in bisexuality, in homosexuality, and a whole range of other kinds of sexuality how the changes have gone from thinking about S&M to thinking about bondage and discipline S&M, and a whole bunch of other X's. That's the bulk of the book, where it really reviews all this stuff, and it reviews it in two ways, I think, which are very important. One is it talks about various social science studies, which is you don't get too often in a psychoanalytic book, but then it reviews the centrality of sexuality in Freud, and also tries to bring it forward in terms of trying to understand what goes on. And there's a delicious quote at the very beginning of the book by Salenza, which is that in the unconscious, no one is married. And I think that's a reminder of the unconscious, and that we're dealing with the unconscious at all times, even when it may not seem like that on the surface. And chapter 3 is about internet porn. And chapter 4 is about the technosex, if I could, I think that's how you call it. But in any event, it's the growing cybersex trend. Okay, let me stop there. Danielle, is that more or less an okay summary of the book?
Well, but before I answer your question, I also want to, just thank the Adelphi Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy for this presentation. I want to thank Dustin and Megan and Elizabeth and Danielle, and particularly you too, Spiro, for agreeing to be part of this dialogue. Let me just backtrack and say why I wrote this book.
Yes, please.
Okay, what inspired me to write this book? Two reasons. One is that I was reading several psychoanalytic authors whom I respect, Andre Green, Peter Fonagy, who wrote about the diminishing presence of sexuality in psychoanalytic literature and presentations. And I was noticing that myself, that case presentations were filled with all kinds of things, but no sex. Apparently Peter Fonagy did a PEP search of words related to sex and sexuality and the body, and found that the frequency of the occurrence of these words was going down over the years. So I was puzzled, because in my practice, that wasn't the case, but I noticed it also, and I was wondering what happened to psychoanalysis. For Freud, sexuality had been such a central concept. In fact, he was accused many times for making it too central. Jung, for example, accused him of that. But what had happened? How did we come so far from that? That was one reason I wanted to explore that. And the second reason, I'm a professor. I'm in contact with a lot of young people, and I've been noticing, and they've been telling me about their changes, the changes they're going through, how they present themselves and their genders, how, they shared with me new sexual practices, things like that. And so I thought that something is going on. On the one hand, our culture is permeated, saturated with sexual images, more and more blatant. The internet is flooded with it. And yet at the same time, there seems to be all of these changes, and also what is called a sexual recession. People are having less sex and having sex later in life. And so I thought all of these paradoxes, all of these things raised questions for me and made me want to explore what has happened over the last 3 decades in gender and sexuality, what kinds of changes have taken place, and where is psychoanalysis with regard to these changes? And so that was the impetus for my writing this book, and trying to bring attention to psychoanalysts to bring sex back into the conversation, but with a new understanding of what has been happening over these last few decades.
Well, what's your idea about the reduction in the psychoanalytic literature? on the topic of sex.
Okay, so this is what I think has happened in psychoanalysis. One of the major reasons I think the reduction of this conversation in psychoanalysis has to do with the shift. First of all, many analysts have come to the conclusion that the Oedipus complex needs to be thrown out. The Oedipus complex, which is the time in childhood, at least for Freud, where the passions reach a certain peak of intensity, where there are jealousies and conflicts and shifting alliances and shifting identifications and, you know, lust and aggression, and all of this comes to a form why Freud felt it was so important. So people have gotten rid of that, and instead the attention has gone to the pre-Oedipal, to mostly the mother-infant dyad. And of course, as Freud said, we are sexual beings from birth on, but the sexuality that takes place between mother-infant has a different quality than the sexuality that begins with the passions of the Oedipal age child. And so so I think that a lot of the increased attention to attachment theory, object relational theory, self-psychology, relational theory, all of these have placed an enormous importance and focus on early relationships, pre-Oedipal, and less sexualized than what was in Freud's time. And so I think that that's probably the main reason why the shift and the diminution of attention to sexuality in psychoanalytic writing.
Well, do you think that contemporary relational theorists and practitioners have no use for the Oedipus complex?
No, I don't think so. Let me just say that the French never abandoned sex. So perhaps as to be expected, but the French, the Lacanians, you know, for example, have always been speaking and writing about sex. I think many of the relational analysts have recognized that they've been ignoring sex to some degree. And I think that there's an attempt to correct that more recently. It's not that nobody has written about it. We're talking about trends here. Yeah.
Okay, good. Because it strikes me, I mean, somebody who's trying to bring together, I mean, people bring together the trends and the traditions very differently, of course. For example, you have Jody Davis writing about, you know, the
erotic transference. Yeah,
erotic transference. You have Andrea Salenza reminding us about a whole host of issues that need to be rethought and reconsidered, and perhaps discovered.
There is a handful of people who have always written about sex and kept that at the forefront.
Yes. And in recent times, we have Morris Eagle, who is writing about, I think he still holds on to something along the lines of drive, but he thinks in terms of attachment. Well, he's a certain line of development, right?
Well, yeah, one of the things that Morris does well, and he's one of the people who writes about attachment theory, but he writes about attachment theory and sexuality, and he sees them as having separate lines of development. We, in the past, when I was training, and perhaps you too, Spiros, there was this idea that people who had better attachments, people who were more evolved psychologically, had better sex. And it was expected that people who were not had difficulty with sexuality. And that has proven not to be the case at all. Mm-hmm. That there are some people who are high functioning, who even have very good relationships, let's say in their marriages or their partnerships, and they don't have sex. They live like siblings. And there are people who are, severe borderlines or whatever, who have passionate sex lives.
But poor attachments.
Excuse me?
But problematic attachments.
Problematic attachments. Yeah. And so what Morris has shown is that these are two separate, two separate things. Even Freud talked about that we often, the sexual attraction is not where the love is, that we have two needs. We have needs for safety, for attachment, and we have needs for novelty and excitement. And those don't always go together.
That sounds a lot like Jay Greenberg's ideas about post-Oedipus in terms of the need for security and the need for mastery. He talks a lot about that, or versions of that. I'm paraphrasing him. Let's see. I just had a thought and I lost it.
So go to your next question then.
But it nags, It's on the tip of my tongue. I know it'll come back to me.
It'll come back.
It'll come. I hope it comes back, because it was brilliant, actually. It's a brilliant question. I hope it comes back. I hope I don't lose it and regain it like an hour after this event. Right. That's the problem with the events, unlike ongoing conversations, right? You do talk that you do say towards the end of your book that what you were learning from patients who were involved with dolls, or from patients that were involved with robots, that kind of got you thinking, and that led to your writing this book. Could you say a little bit about that? And maybe even there you gave a few clinical illustrations. I think they're wonderful. If you mind repeating them a little bit, and then I guess I want to work backwards from the book.
Okay. So this is in the chapter on technology.
Techno-sex, I think you call it.
Yes. One of the main things that have changed, like Spiro said, that I divided the book into 4 sections. The 4 sections that I think have changed the most, have changed our sexuality the most: gender, new forms of sexual attachments and behaviors, internet pornography, and technology, techno-sex. Internet pornography is also technology, but I separated them. So in the thing that Spiros is right, that one of the things that changed my interest, I was interested in creativity and psychology of art. I spent many years writing and talking about that and other things. But one of the things that moved me towards sexuality and technology came from one patient, a patient that I had who lived with a doll, a sex doll, a silicone humanoid doll, very realistic doll, $10,000 cost.
Expensive doll.
Expensive doll. And he was in a relationship with this doll. He was intimate with the doll. He wasn't just using the doll for sex, although that's how it began. It evolved into a very intimate, for him, relationship. And so this was new to me. The last I knew, there were these blow-up dolls, that if you punctured them, that was the end of them. So this was very new to me. It opened up a whole world. And because he was my patient, I became very curious. And beyond what he was telling me, I became a researcher, not just a clinician. And I sought out on these online forums for this subculture of doll enthusiasts called idolaters. I sought out men, it's mostly men, by a large majority, who live with and love their dolls. And I interviewed over 15 of these men and got to know the dynamics of this kind of relationship. But in particular, my patient, who I call Jack, opened up this world for me, and I wanted to learn more. And as I became more of a researcher, not just a clinician, I learned that there's a whole subculture that is growing, and I extended it to my interest in technology and sexuality in general. So, of course, internet porn has exploded, has changed the internet. Pornhub, which is the most popular internet pornography site, is, it has about 1 billion visits a day, 1 billion, and has every single kind of, sex on it. And so I started really inquiring, not just about technology and sex, but how technology is really changing our relationships, and including the way sexuality is being expressed. Many people are only having sex today through technology, through pornography, or through sex chats, or things like that. So we're moving in a certain direction that I think is unstoppable. And because of that, I became more and more interested in it. David Levy, a British AI specialist and roboticist, is predicting that we will be marrying robots within a few decades. And a lot of AI experts agree with him. So I think that we need to catch up. And at least I felt I needed to catch up with this trend and understand better what is happening. So to tell you a little bit about the case, this is a man who came to me initially, did not want to let go of the doll because this doll provided a lot of gratification for him. He had a terrible relationship with his mother. He had 2 failed marriages. He felt rejected and demeaned by women in his past, and just decided, as some of these men do, that they're not going to play that game anymore. And they still have their needs. They still have sexual needs, needs for intimacy, needs for love. And what they do is they turn to the dolls. And these dolls are very beautiful. They're like art objects, and they are there for them whenever they want. My patient said, a silent wife is a gift from the Lord. So they like the silence. Now they're putting artificial intelligence into the heads of the dolls, and so the dolls speak and respond. But many of the men don't want that. They want the doll to be silent. They want to be able to project onto the doll whatever they want the doll to be. So what I've discovered with these men is how much they project parts of themselves onto this doll, and then they engage in what they feel is a mutual relationship.
Yeah. Danielle, can I interrupt you? I want to read you refer to that patient, you use the name Jack, and I want to read an excerpt that you have, something that Jack says.
Okay.
That I think is very touching, because there's something, of course, on some level, it's off-putting to think about, Jack relating to a doll the way that he is. But here's what he says, and you quote him: kids believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Most people believe in God. Almost everyone needs an imaginary friend in their corner, even though they have no physical evidence of that friend's existence. Well, I have concrete evidence of my friend's existence. Did you see that movie, the one with Tom Hanks, Castaway? Remember how the guy is bleeding from his hand and touches the soccer ball? He accidentally gives it a face and then names it Wilson. Over time, Wilson becomes real to him, and he comes to love Wilson and believes Wilson cares about him. After a while, you even get the feeling that he's forgotten that Wilson is just a volleyball. Anything could become alive if you're lonely enough.
Yes. And it is very touching. When he said that to me, I was very moved. And it made me not just more empathic towards him, it made me realize how much we all, those of us who are in relationships, project a lot into those relationships, into the partner that we happen to be with. So on the one hand, you know, people see this as this very odd and exceptional outlier type of behavior. Many call it perverse. On the other hand, I was also seeing what was universal, what could be universal in this. So I studied catfishing too, when people pretend that there's someone else online in order to lure someone into a romantic relationship. And that too seems like it's an imposter, they're fake. And yet what I learned there too is how malleable the self is, right? It made me question how we look at the self as this static entity when really it's very malleable, and we can, you know, put ourselves into all kinds of self states. So my treatment with Jack, in the end, he did leave the doll after bringing her to me one day, because he wanted me to meet the doll after we had spoken about the doll for so many sessions. And at some point, I think because he had developed a positive relationship to me, and I was accepting and non-judgmental towards his life with the doll, he started appreciating that perhaps he could be with a human woman who wouldn't be rejecting of him. And he was willing to take the chance to go out into that world again. And so that was the course of treatment. But a lot of the men who I've interviewed who live with dolls choose not to do that. They like their life with the dolls, and they do not see themselves going either to the human world or back to the human world.
There is another clinical illustration that I thought was really quite powerful, because it was very nuanced psychoanalytically in terms of understanding. I think you demonstrate an understanding of the dynamics, and that had to do with the businessman, the 50-year-old businessman you call Philip, who is addicted to pornography. And I'm wondering if you could say a few words about that, because I thought there were so many powerful dynamics that were operating, and on many levels, by the way, in the family too. So, and perhaps you might even say something about the children. About that. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
So the man I call Philip came to me with the presenting problem was that he was addicted to porn, and he knew it was taking over his life. This was a very, very successful man who had a very, top level position, and yet was finding himself obsessed, compelled to masturbate almost all the time. When he wasn't masturbating to porn, he was thinking about when he could masturbate to porn. It completely took over his waking thoughts and behavior. And it became so detrimental, he wasn't able to function without this. So, I got to know him, and one of what I discovered is this family dynamic, that he was married to a woman and they had 3 children together. And when after the woman had children, she stopped being interested in sex. That was one part, and that happens with a lot of couples, by the way. That's a lot of times when people have affairs or go to porn. The other thing was that the wife she was very, very wealthy. And so even though my patient was a CEO of a company, brought home a very nice salary. It was nothing compared to what the wife was bringing in. And so, and she reminded him of this all the time, as if he was nothing and was providing nothing, and it really all came from her. So she belittled him, and he was angry, and she was very controlling, cut him off from his family. So all he had was her, and she was belittling him. And so he turned to pornography, partly for satisfaction because he wasn't getting it with her, but partly also as revenge. And I think this is very important because Robert Stoller, who wrote a lot about sexuality and about perversion, and even called perversion the erotic form of hatred, saw the connection between sexuality and perversion and hostility. And it was very, very clear that something like that was going on with this patient. And so by analyzing the family dynamics and the dynamics with his wife, and empowering Philip to be stronger within his marriage, he started relying on pornography less. But what really turned the corner was that he had left his iPad someplace with the porn site on, and one of his daughters found it. And she wrote something like on it, like, "You should be ashamed," or something like that. And that really was a wake-up call for him, that he had gone way too far, and was willing to begin addressing this in a very, very serious way. Apropos the children, most children are exposed to pornography in this kind of way, a kind of sloppy older sibling or parent who leaves things open. And most children today are exposed to pornography between the ages of 9 and 11, which is very young. And as we write in this book, we're not against pornography. There are pros and cons for pornography, but there were two really negative results of pornography. And one is that people get very addicted, and the earlier they're exposed to pornography, the more addictive it is. And secondly, for children, when they're exposed early, what it does is pornography is it's a visual medium. It's very powerful. And what it does is it shows, this instant gratification and satisfaction. And children who are just developing their own ideas of what their desires are presented with these images, these videos, and told, this is what your desire is. They get excited watching it. And so they get confused and start thinking, well, that's what I want. So it kind of hijacks their desire, the work of desire. And they don't have the benefit of developing their own desire and knowing what it is, because they're exposed to this too soon at a time when they should be exploring themselves. And so in that sense, it can be very deleterious to their development of desire.
Yeah, that's very important. And it also, on the other hand, it also reminds me of advertising to children, and how they begin to desire the advertisements that they consume by kind of a capitalism that's going amok, right? And they want certain things, right? Speaking of addiction to pornography, one of the things that you mentioned is that there's a tendency with addiction to also escalate.
Yes.
To more excessive, more overwhelming types of at least you didn't use that word for the escalation, but could you say a little bit more about how it seems to go from from soft porn? How does it go from soft porn to
hardcore?
Hardcore, including playing with death and bondage and S&M. Do you have any So how does that happen?
Well, what happens is, like all addictions, you need more and more, right? They become one of the attractions to pornography is that it's easy, it's accessible, it's free, and it's quick. So you don't have to work for it. And it's novel. Somebody who looks at porn can go to a different site each time. A person can imagine they are having sex. They can put themselves in the place of the actors and imagine they are having sex with a new partner each time. So for somebody who looks for novelty, it's this cornucopia. I call it pornocopia, right?
Yes.
Of options and choices. And so you don't have to get satiated. But what happens is they up the ante. They start getting bored or satiated with this kind of porn, the more soft porn. They get curious, they go to a little bit harder porn and then harder porn. They need more to get excited. And so a lot of people go down this slippery slope from softer porn to harder porn. And the harder porn is much more sadomasochistic. And one or two studies that I found even found that certain people who started with very light pornography ended up watching child pornography without having any past desire for children. So this like slippery slope occurs. Just like with drugs, you need more and more to get your fix. The same thing happens with pornography.
Could you say a little bit about the guilt and the shame and the excitement of the pornocopia?
Well, shame is something that accompanies sexuality, porn or no porn, because sexuality is not politically correct. If you go on the Pornhub, you will see every unpolitically correct form of pornography. There's incest pornography, there's racist pornography, there's everything that, people have talked about the sexual brain as being completely unpolitically correct. Freud talked about us as being polymorphous perverse as infants. And that's why he believed that we are universal. Perversity is universal. It's just that we get socialized. Civilization curbs that in and says, no, you can't do this, you can't do that, that's bad, that's wrong. Until, what was anything goes, everything excites to, oh, we can only do this, or only with this person, or only in this way. Right? But that doesn't mean that our fantasies have stopped being polymorphous perverse, or, Freud thought sexuality is antisocial by nature. It's restless, it's antisocial. And that's why we have laws. Laws are there to curb the sexuality. Even the 10 commandments have 2 commandments against sexuality. Do not covet your neighbor's wife and do not commit adultery. Two of the 10 are repeated just to make sure you get it through your head that this is something you're not supposed to do. So and that's why so much of sexuality is attracted to the forbidden, right? Because sexuality wants to break through boundaries. It wants to, just like technology. What was the question? I lost my way. Shame
and guilt and excitement.
That they go together.
Yeah, excitement too.
They often go together, partly because we learn from society, we learn to be ashamed of our sexual desires. Many of our sexual desires, as I said, are for forbidden fruit. And so that's part of the excitement is, I want something I can't have or shouldn't have, but it's also part of the shame and the guilt. And sometimes the more you feel that shame and guilt, the more there is excitement. So, for example, there are a lot of people who say, get rid of the term perversion. It's, it's a negative term. It stigmatizes. But people like Robert Stoller and some of us who write about perversion say, no, the whole point of perversion is that they want to cross boundaries. They want to sometimes feel that they're sinning. That's part of what fuels the fire. So these things do often go hand in hand.
Yes. Sort of speaking of boundaries, sex involved body, sex and sexual identity and gender identities involve the body.
Yes.
And more so than ever, we are dealing or becoming more aware of issues of transgender, of transsexuals, of changes that people are choosing to make or want to make to their own bodies. At one point, you describe a person who wanted to get rid of the penis.
Yes.
That they had, but maintain the head and put the head of the penis onto the constructed vagina. Now that's extreme, and I don't think that goes on all the time. But could you say a little bit about the body in relation to the new sexual landscape?
Well, the body is related to every sexual landscape. We're born in bodies. And one of the things, this actually connects to your previous question, Spiros, that one of the reasons we feel shame is because when we have sex, we are reminded that we have an animal body. We have a body that is flesh and blood and ages and gets sick and dies. And so,
oh no.
Yes.
Really?
And, yes.
Oh, that hurts.
It hurts, and it makes us, it has what Muriel Dimon called the ooh factor.
Yes. Oh, what a beautiful phrase. Yeah.
So we're reminded of that. On the one hand, yes, we have sexual drive. We're driven just like other animals. On the other hand, we like to think of ourselves as, more elevated species. And in some ways we are, because for us, much of the time, sex is not just sex, it's eros, right? We give meaning to the sex. We humanize the sex, right? And that turns it into the erotic, but not always. Sometimes sex is just sex, right? It doesn't always have to have meaning. But because we are bodies, and because we are naked and bodies of the flesh, and we're in some ways very open and vulnerable in that way, it reminds us of everything that's related to the body, that we are just these animal bodies who have this lust, who have these drives, who these bodies are aging, right? We have shame about our bodies, about how they look, about how they're going to be accepted or not. So it's a very complex, that's why it's so important how people view themselves sexually and experience their sexuality, whether it's with pleasure or transcendence or going beyond the self and joining with another person, or whether it's a place where there's a lot of hostility or attempt at mastery or repair of previous trauma. There are a lot of people in bed with us when we have sex, right? The way we've been treated, the way our bodies have been treated, power differentials, all of that comes into play when people are having sex or even fantasizing about sex.
Sometimes even the analyst is in the bed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When people are, not just when a patient tells the analyst that they're attracted to the analyst or they want to have sex with them, even when they're talking about their sex lives, the analyst is implicated. You're there listening, imagining, visualizing what the patient is expressing. It's like a primal scene. You're like the kid who walked into a primal scene. We're always implicated when we are talking about sex or when we're even writing about sex. I once had a patient say to me, I know you enjoy sex. And I said, how do you know that? And she said, well, the way you say sex. And I said, well, how do I say it? And she said, sex. And so I thought, I was a little puzzled because I thought she was going to, say something very sexy. And it was just so matter of fact. And then I realized that was what she meant, that because I could say it like I could say anything else, I must be comfortable with it. At least that's how I understood what she was saying. Yeah. And a lot of my colleagues ask me, because they read my cases and they say, how do you get this patient population that talks about sex? And I said, well, I ask them about their sex lives. Sometimes it's that simple. And
well, we do have a license to ask all kinds of things.
Yeah, but a lot of people don't, because they're embarrassed or they're ashamed or they feel they're probing or they're being intrusive. But sex is a huge part of people's lives. And so why wouldn't we want to know the sexual history and story of our patients?
Well, I think just as it could be destabilizing or mysterious for patients, it could still hold that for us, even if we have the license to ask about sexuality, even if at one point it was common to think about sexuality as central. I think that we have an unconscious too. Yeah. So I think the unconscious is always playing out for us. And
our patients
room is populated for
our patients feel when you're comfortable talking about sex and when you're not. And if they feel that you're not, they're not going to bring it up.
Yeah. We should stop in a few minutes, Danielle. And I had a question that I wanted to ask about what, if anything, may have surprised you in writing this book?
Oh, a lot of things surprise me.
Give us a top surprise.
When I'm surprised, I always want to know more. But I think that what surprised me the most was the technology piece.
The technology.
Where technology is taking us sexually. I mean, I knew nothing about teledildonics. I don't know how many people in this
I love that section.
But teledildonics, these are bodysuits that people can wear, and they can have sex across the world. And the two of them are connected to a computer, and one can, direct sensations in the other, sensations of being penetrated or of penetrating through these bodysuits and with the use of a computer. I mean, this is where we've gone. It's not just a doll or a robot. It's also being able to have sex at a distance and really feel as if you're having actual sex.
It's amazing.
So these things were surprising to me.
I have to share, before we stop, I have to share one thing which really surprised me.
Okay.
Where you wrote, you did your history on this, and you wrote that in ancient Greece, they used olive oil for sex, during sex. That was, I couldn't believe that you wrote that. That shocked me.
Why?
Okay.
Because you didn't know it, or because I wrote it?
Because all I do is eat olive oil. I love olive oil. How am I going to look at olive oil the same way again? Okay,